All right. Okay, everybody. Nice to see everybody. Hope you're joining our schmoozing conversation. Okay, part two of Unorthodox, Isaiah Berlin. So we actually studied here in Chat and Ethics his famous essay, which I assume you will discuss on liberty. But anyway, so that for high school kids, that's like pretty impressive. So Bavakasha, Isaiah Berlin, of course, who lived in London, but you don't need to tell you that. And Rabbi Barry, Bavakasha.
Actually, Isaiah Berlin lived 10-minute drive from where I am now. So, there's I didn't put it in my notes, but there's a nice blue plaque. I don't know if you have blue plaques. We have blue plaques. If somebody lived somewhere, you have their name on the wall and the dates they lived there. It's Nebuch because some people, only lived in a house for like 6 weeks, but they've got to have their blue plaque up to say that this great person lived there. So I'm going to share my handout straight away because the first thing I want to do is pick up something that I mentioned last week. And I promised I would share the quote. And it's a quote from Rav Kook. And I usually make the mistake and I don't put a picture of Rav Kook because I assume everyone knows what Rav Kook looks like. But, when I tell the Rembrandt story in Rav Kook, now you imagine somebody like this walking into an art gallery today, it's completely crazy. So, Rav Kook looked the part. So Rav Kook said in his commentary on the Siddur, all the words and paths that lead to the ways of heresy themselves lead fundamentally, if we seek out the source, to a greater depth of faith, one that is more illuminating and life-giving than the simple understanding that was illuminated prior to the revelation of that outburst. I mean, it's beautiful English, but I'm sure the Hebrew was even better. I have the Hebrew somewhere. This is a remarkable statement by a remarkable rabbi, and I'm not teaching Rav Kook, obviously, but I have a sense that there are really two approaches to knowledge outside of Judaism. We can either shut it off and we can be scared by it, or we can embrace it. I mean, when appropriate. Am I not loud enough?
I hear you loud and clear. Mel,
Okay.
perhaps it's your own computer. I know. Does anybody else have a problem with the volume? No, yeah, we hear you loud and clear. Thank you.
Okay, so it's fascinating because I'm teaching the Guide for the Perplexed at the moment to some university students, and the Rambam is like we just learned several chapters, and chapter 51 of the first part, he mentions so much Greek philosophy, so much Arabic, Islamic philosophy, and my students are like, when did he have time to learn Torah? And so, we don't jump into these heresies, we'll call them heresies of Rav Kook, but we shouldn't be afraid of them because they can illuminate in a way that is very, very special. So we're going to turn to Isaiah Berlin. I have to say, while I was preparing this, I thought to myself I might want to break Mark Shapiro's record of 18 classes on Saul Lieberman, but I'm going to try and do it in 1 hour because there's so much to say about Isaiah Berlin. And he had an incredible life. We're going to look briefly at his biography. There's our nice picture. I love this picture because it's really is Isaiah Berlin, the Oxford Don, right? He was professor at Oxford. There's lots to say about his time at Oxford. Apart from being a student there, he started a whole college there. He was the first non-converted Jew to receive a fellowship at All Saints at Oxford, right? That was really something back in those days, but he looked the part, right? I don't know about where you're all from, Canada, North America, wherever, Israel. In England, we still wear pocket squares, right, in our jackets, right? It's a very, Jay, you remember I looked very dapper when I came to Orach Chaim, right? A three-piece suit and a pocket square, that's what makes us British. Stiff upper lip and the suit we wear and all of the extra bits. So let's tell you a little bit about Berlin. The most important thing that I want to focus on for a few minutes is not that he was born in Riga. It was interesting because he was born in Latvia, there were certain jobs he couldn't take for the British during the Second World War. Not that they thought he was a spy, but he didn't have clearance. But more importantly than the place he was born was the place they moved to, and that was Petrograd in Russia. And he was 6 years old, which means it was 1915. And he was 8 years old during the February and October revolutions in Russia. And these are incredibly formative experiences for him. Imagine being an 8-year-old during the revolutions. And there's an incredible quote that I want to share with you where he thinks about what it was like to be a young boy in during the Russian revolutions. He says, I was 7.5 and something. And did I tell you the terrible sight of the policeman being dragged, not policeman, a sharpshooter from the rooftop being dragged away by a lynching mob? And then he talks about the police that were employed by the Tsar called the Pharaon. It's really a Pharaon. I'd never seen this word before, but that's really what they were called. He says it's not in the books, but it's true. And they sniped at the revolutionaries from roofs or attics and things. A man was dragged. Terrible sights he saw as a 7.5, 8-year-old. And at the end of this quote, he's remembering the Russian Revolution. He says, that gave me a permanent horror of violence, which has remained with me for the rest of my life. And so this is extremely formative in terms of his ideas going forward. He Well, we'll see what he thinks about freedom and liberty. While he was a student at Corpus Christi, he took a course in philosophy, and he got a higher grade than A.J. Ayer, who was this great British philosopher later on. So we get an idea that even at a very young age, while he was studying philosophy, he was an incredible achiever. 1932, he was only 23-year-old, prize fellowship at All Souls College. I'm not going to talk about the years really between sort of 32 and his death, because they're just filled with him writing books, professorships, like incredible output. But I did note that in 1979, he receives the Jerusalem Prize for his defense of civil liberties. I was just doing a little bit of Chazorah. It's interesting that although we have a large corpus of his work, he didn't particularly like writing. And one of his biographers says that he had a little tape recorder, and he would dictate his books. And that's why his books, if you read them, have quite a discursive style about them. And sometimes it's a bit like learning Gemara, right? He jumps around from one topic to another topic because that's how his mind's working. But he would also record conversations with people. I'm not sure I would want him as a dinner guest, but then these conversations would be transcribed and ideas would come out of them. So that was the way that he liked to write and be creative. And this quote from The Economist, I don't know if any of you read The Economist, it's great. But it said about Berlin, as in real showbiz, his reputation spread in ever-widening circles from an admiring center. He had 23 honorary doctorates from eminent universities, possibly a record, and many academic awards. I'm trying to get my first PhD. He's got 23 honorary doctorates. As well as being knighted, he received a rarer honor, the Order of Merit, which is limited to 24 people. We'll see how he described himself, right? He sounds like he's the most brilliant Brit, right? He's British and more British than the British, but we'll see. A writer on Western philosophy noted that a cousin of Sir Isaiah was the leader of a Jewish sect and proclaimed by thousands of his followers to be the Messiah. So you may know, but his cousin was the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And there's some amazing correspondence. I think there were a couple of letters between him and the Rebbe. He wrote to the Rebbe's father. He had more of a relationship with the Rebbe's father, but they were both descended from the Tzemach Tzedek, I think. So, but they were cousins. So Isaiah did not match that, right? He wasn't a Messiah. But The Economist says, in Oxford terms, he may have come close, right? He was, the greatest of the great in terms of thinkers, and somebody we should pay real close attention to. So now there's a much longer book list than this, but I'll just say these are the books that I own of Isaiah Berlin's. And there are some things that are missing there, but there are other things that, there are essays all over the place. But these are the books that I've worked through over the years. They're actually really fun to read. They are nice reads. Some philosophers are terrible to read, and Berlin is quite nice to read. But along with all of these books, these are books that I have about Isaiah Berlin. In some way, there's a typo there. It's not Isaiah Berlin. Isaiah Berlin, it's a bit Lahavdil. It's a bit like the Rambam, right? I mean, I have 3 shelves of books about the Rambam. And Berlin is starting to grow in terms of academia. I mean, it's been going on for decades, but there's lots and lots to read about Berlin. Now, I'm just going to pause my presentation to catch a breath, because that's all the background stuff. I give a little bit of a health warning now. It's not a big health warning, it's a little health warning. This is not a lecture about Rabbi Sachs or Rabbi Sachs and Isaiah Berlin, but the next few slides, in fact, the next slide, we could spend most of the rest of the shir talking about. Rabbi Sachs gave us a real insight into the thought of Berlin and his connection to Judaism, or his thoughts connection to Judaism. So don't worry, we're not going to just do Rabbi Sachs, but after I finish this piece on Sachs, I'm going to move on to some incredible quotes about Isaiah Berlin and Judaism and Zionism. So bear with me. I'm just going to check the chat. I haven't been keeping an eye. Have I missed anything? No. Okay, great. So every year, there are multiple lectures in memory of Isaiah Berlin. And there's one in, I think it's Highgate Shore, Hampstead Shore, I can't remember which one. There's one in Oxford College. There are all these annual lectures. And the material that I'm quoting from Rabbi Sachs was taken, he gave the annual Isaiah Berlin lecture. But Isaiah Berlin in 1952 said the following, and this comes under, in Rabbi Sachs's lecture, Isaiah Berlin's defense of freedom. The defense of freedom is a central idea. I'm going to unpack it quite a lot. But Berlin said the essence of liberty has always lain in the ability to choose as you wish to choose, because you wish so to choose, uncoerced, unbullied, not swallowed up in some vast system, and in the right to resist, to be unpopular, to stand up for your convictions merely because they are your convictions. That is true freedom, and without it there is neither freedom of any kind, nor even the illusion of it. Now, this quote is a beautiful quote that sums up one half of Isaiah Berlin's philosophy on freedom. I'm going to use the word liberty because it fits with the way he wrote about it, but it's the same thing, freedom. And he wrote probably his most famous essay was Two Concepts of Liberty in 1958. And in that essay, he talks about 2 ideas. And the 2 ideas are negative liberty and positive liberty. And then, he goes on for pages about it, and people have written books about it, but it's very simple. Negative liberty is freedom from, right? It means that nobody starts, as in this quote from 1952, you are free to do what you like. Nobody is stopping you, coercing you, freedom from. But positive liberty is freedom to, is to do things. right? Uh, they're two sides of the same coin. And I want to give you one quote from Berlin for each of these, which I think will make it nice and clear. He says, I am normally said to be free to the degree to which no human being interferes with my activity, right? No one interferes with what I'm doing. That's negative liberty. But positive liberty is that the wish on the part of the individual to be his own master. I wish to be a subject, not an object, to be moved by reasons, by conscious purposes which are my own, not by causes which affect me, as it were, from outside. Now, the problem is that Berlin recognized that in terms of positive liberty, this led to all sorts of fanaticism. And this led to Nazism, for example. It's easy to pick on Nazism. And negative liberty, the problem we end up with is it's like it's a free-for-all, right? Nobody can stop me doing what I want to do. You can't coerce me. You can't bully me. I can, in my own home, everything is okay. And in fact, Rabbi Sachs disagrees with Berlin. He thinks that both of these presentations are missing something. It's not enough to say you need negative liberty, freedom from, and it's certainly not enough to say you should have freedom too. So Rabbi Sachs gives a Jewish third way, right? We've got two opinions, so we'll add a third opinion. And the third opinion is based, I'm not going to spend long on this, but it's a beautiful piece. It's based on the different words for freedom that we have in Judaism. And Rabbi Sachs says that the word chofshi, which means, it means freedom, but it means like a holiday, right? He says that type of freedom is a temporary type of freedom. It just disappears. He says it's like writing something on parchment. Over time, the parchment will just degrade, disappear. It's not real freedom. He says, but cherut, right? Nisan is Zman Cherutenu, Pesach Zman Cherutenu. The idea of freedom there is a permanent freedom. It's freedom, he says, which is engraved in stone, right? It will last, as he says, from generation to generation, right? Freedom has to have some substance. And the freedom that Rabbi Sachs wants to express is a freedom of tradition. And I looked all over his essays on Isaiah Berlin and his essay, Rabbi Sachs I'm talking about, and his essays on freedom. And I couldn't see that he expressed the following idea. And I was surprised because he talks about it in many ways, in many places. And I think it fits beautifully with this distinction. Because Rabbi Sachs often says that in Judaism, we don't have rights, right? We don't have rights. You don't have a right to be whatever you want to be. You don't have the right to, to do whatever you want. That's not freedom. When we stood at Mount Sinai and we accepted the Torah, we weren't given rights. What were we given? Responsibility. We were given, the Torah and mitzvot and halachot. So it strikes me as really interesting that Rabbi Sachs wants to find a space between negative liberty and positive liberty. But I almost feel like it's a subset of positive liberty, right? I have the freedom to do the mitzvot, right? And I think this is a fascinating distinction to be made and central to Isaiah Berlin. If we're going to understand Berlin, this idea of liberty is crucial. And Rabbi Sachs said of Isaiah Berlin, if there was one ritual which Sir Isaiah cherished above others, it was the Pesach Seder. So even though he wasn't Orthodox, we'll see what he said about reform as well. He wasn't associated with any stream of Judaism. Well, certainly while his mother was alive, as far as I remember, every year he would go to Seder with her. Passover evening with its narrative of freedom. Judaism is a faith which began and is sustained annually in the reminder of what the lack of freedom feels like. The bread of affliction, the bitter herbs of slavery. There's a strong degree of kinship, elective affinity, family resemblance between the work of Isaiah Berlin and the tradition of which he was part. So, I wouldn't say that this is a proof of anything. It's more of an interesting anecdote that the one festival or the one idea that Berlin associated himself with in terms of Judaism was Pesach. And Pesach is the festival, the moment of freedom par excellence. So that's the first thing the Rabbi Sachs deals with, which is the defense of freedom. The second idea, and I introduced these briefly last week, but the second idea that Rabbi Sachs picks up in the thought of Berlin is the power of ideas. So Isaiah, I like the way he calls him Isaiah, believed that history is not simply the play of blind causes. It is not governed by causal necessity as Spinoza thought, nor inexorable economic forces as Marx argued, nor by biological or sociobiological imperatives as Darwin's followers have maintained. It's really fascinating. I'm sure many of you have read a lot of the works of Rabbi Sachs, but Rabbi Sachs often attacked the ideas of Marx and Darwin for being, used for the wrong reasons or for being deterministic. So Isaiah was not a determinist. He believed that human action is not simply a response to a situation, but a response to how we perceive and interpret the situation. And that depends on the ideas we bring to bear on it, right? What we think, and given our freedom as rational beings, that means that we have this fascinating, important role, right? It's that the world doesn't just go on and we're fated that something will happen. Ideas have an important role to play. Seemingly in the 21st century and social media, ideas are taking a back seat, but no doubt Isaiah Berlin would have really bemoaned that, and Rabbi Sachs certainly did bemoan that. The third of the idea, there's one more quote from Rabbi Sachs because beautiful on the power of ideas. So Isaiah Berlin's whole work was a kind of commentary to the famous line from Zechariah, the prophet, that we achieve the great human victories not by might nor by force, but by my spirit, says God. It is not too much to say that Jewish history is the supreme example of a people sustained by ideas. Exile and redemption, covenant and destiny, justice and compassion. Indeed, Jews survived as a nation for almost 2,000 years without any normal attributes of a nation, shared territory and overarching political order, a common culture or the same language of everyday life. Jewish history depended on the existence of a set of shared ideas, the hopes begotten by those ideas and the practices in which they were expressed. So I always find it fascinating. Of course, we have different minhagim, different customs across the Jewish world, but there were central ideas and themes which were consistent all over the Jewish world. We had shared ideas, whether it was Shabbat or Kashrut, whether it was belief in certain principles. These are the ideas that kept the Jewish people together, right? Just because we were in exile, just because we were thrown across the four corners of the world, didn't mean that we lost our Jewish identity. But that identity and history is dependent entirely on ideas. People of the book, right? That's what we've been called. Okay, the last quote that I want to share from Rabbi Sachs, and it's linked to the last one, but we sort of have to have a context of what was going on in certainly British analytic philosophy And it was a philosophy that was really, I mean, it says here, dominated by linguistic philosophy, philosophy of language. And for many, it was going down a bit of a dark path because, you couldn't say anything, you couldn't understand anything you were saying. Philosophy of language, Wittgenstein, it's all murky. It's really hard to actually come up with any answers to anything. So Rabbi Sachs says the gust of fresh air that Isaiah breathed into Oxford in the 1950s and 60s was one of the most arid periods in British philosophy, dominated by linguistic philosophy, in which it was argued you could solve or dissolve philosophical problems simply by clarifying what words mean. This was philosophy almost without a sense of history. And here was Isaiah Berlin speaking with intimate knowledge of writers most of us never heard of, let alone read. I mean, I would put my hand up and say these 6 thinkers I've never heard of or read except in preparing this shir. Maybe I should be embarrassed, but Belinsky, Bakunin, Herder, Herzen, Ficino, and Fourier. I mean, if anyone's read any of them, well done. There is a line in Hallel, says Rabbi Sachs, I called to God from my confinement. He answered me with expanses. This is what Isaiah gave Oxford philosophy in those days. He was the man who rescued British philosophy from its parochialism and showed that ideas are not timeless, they are set in time. Right? You can't just take a big question about philosophy of religion or metaphysics or any big philosophical question and just say, well, before you can ask whether God exists or if God is all powerful, the philosopher's language would say, what do you mean by the word God? Not in terms of defining, God being all powerful, but or what does it mean exist? And you'd have to break up the whole sentence. You'd never get anywhere. And it was so narrow. But ideas are much bigger than that and much broader. And that's what Rabbi Sachs says Isaiah Berlin brought back to Oxford. So that's a nice sort of Jewish reading of Isaiah Berlin when he's not really writing about Jewish ideas. But now, what I want to spend the second half of this shir talking about is Isaiah Berlin's view of various Jewish ideas. And actually, I don't think they are too challenging. They're fascinating. Many of them are taken from his biographers who spent time with him or had access to all of his letters. So they give us a real insight. But we're going to look at his attitude to Judaism and Israel and Zionism. And we'll see. I will deal with questions at the end, I promise. So let's see first what he says about Jews. So this is in Michael Ignatieff's biography is a really wonderful biography. It's very readable and it's I think pretty comprehensive. I think I enjoyed it most of the biographies. To be a Jew, he said, was to have a special understanding of loneliness. It was also to know how deeply men and women needed to be at home somewhere in the world. Belonging was more than a possession of land and statehood. It was the condition of being understood itself. And this line, this couple of lines, is so packed with wonderful ideas and challenging ideas. Firstly, having a special understanding of loneliness. The most famous person to talk about loneliness from an Orthodox Jewish perspective was probably Rav Soloveitchik in The Lonely Man of Faith. But, lonely as in spread across the world, in exile, just in a sort of sociological, historical sense. In a religious sense, where tiny religion holding out as the one true revealed religion. So there could be a more existential loneliness than just historical. But he says, and I want you to remember this, I will remind you next week when we look at George Steiner, that we need to be at home somewhere. And belonging is more than possession of land and statehood, it's also being understood. And when I wrote this, or I put this together, thinking so much about what's going on in Israel at the moment, the last 18, 19 months now. We are in possession of a land and we have a state. But that doesn't stop us feeling lonely, says Berlin, because we want to be understood. And the shocking, I mean, almost unbelievable rise of anti-Semitism since October 7th, and the feeling that we are alone on the one hand, but also not understood. I'm in no way saying that Israel has, I'm not saying they've done anything wrong, but I'm also not saying they've done everything perfectly. In every war, things happen which shouldn't happen. But there's this feeling of being misunderstood, right? Um, you know, Yesterday's tragic story of a young woman on the way to have a baby being killed. It just beggars belief that that's not across the front page of every major newspaper. So feeling misunderstood, I think Berlin associated clearly himself and understood the Jewish existential problem. But next week we'll see George Steiner, who had a totally different approach, and a great thinker also. So just hold on to that thought. So in another one of the books about Berlin's life, Berlin is described as undoubtedly a very secular Jew, highly, if not bitterly, suspicious of rabbinic conceits and religious institutions. Now, I'm not going to say everyone, I also am suspicious of rabbinic conceit and religious institutions when I should be, but he described himself as religiously tone deaf, hinting that in his view, the rational, empirical mind can only tolerate a very limited degree of theologico-mysticist pandemonium. I mean, this is just such a wonderful phrase. Now, I wonder whether, if thinking about negative liberty, right, the freedom from, would have felt to him like a clash which he couldn't overcome. Judaism is prescriptive of everyday, all day actions, from the minute I wake up to the minute I go to sleep. I wake up, I wash my hands, I say Modeh Ani, and then I'll go to the bathroom and then say a blessing, and then I'll pray, and then I'll say a blessing before I have breakfast. Everything, every minute is prescribed. So freedom from, I'm not sure that I've ever seen him apply coercion to the formula, but it feels a little bit like, it could slip into that. Nevertheless, says Dubnov, he insisted on presenting his identity by relying on a non-political, pre-theorized sense of Jewishness. Right? He didn't deny his Jewishness. Judeo-centricity was the way Berlin referred to it once, in a letter he sent to his close friend, philosopher Stuart Hampshire, after his mother's passing. I suppose I do owe my Judeo-centricity to her and her world and Russian Jewish cultural roots, he wrote. And it is fascinating. Remember, I said that he felt very aligned to the Seder night because of it, Festival of Freedom. But maybe it wasn't that. Maybe, we're just drawing some conclusion. He just respected his mother and tradition was there, but he did maintain this connection to his Jewish cultural roots. It's interesting. He says, to Russian Jewish cultural roots, not Jewish Russian. I'm not going to read anything into that, but it's a fascinating insight into how he felt about his Judaism. Okay. So with all of our thinkers, the question of Israel and Zionism is going to be the most challenging in many ways. I mean, many of you will agree with him. Many of you will agree with him wholeheartedly, and many of you will vehemently be opposed to what he says. But he has a fascinating take, and don't forget the central ideas that I've proposed are non-violence and freedom. And so Michael Ignatieff says the last 20 years of his life, so from about 1977 to 1997, roughly, saw him ever more perplexed, angered, and depressed by what had happened to his Zionist dreams. Right? He was a Zionist. He had believed in partition since the Peel Commission of 1937, at which point he was 28 years old, right? And to the end of his life, he saw himself as a two-state Zionist, committed both to the state of Israel and to the sharing of the land with the Palestinians. I have no idea what he would have said after October 7th. I'm not going to imagine. But he was a proponent of the two-state solution, living side by side. Indeed, the situation embodied exactly those conflicts between competing goods that his own philosophical view regarded as inescapable in moral life. So he has a fascinating theory, which I decided not to talk about, but a pluralism when there's a clash of ideas. And he feels that that's okay. You can have a pluralism of ideas, but there is a conflict. On a conflict between two rights of self-determination of equal validity, he could not envisage any other solution than for Israel to cede significant parts of the occupied territories to a Palestinian authority. This steady conviction set him against the Begin and Shamir governments. So, Oslo was an attempt at that in some ways. Oslo II and Ehud Barak's offer to Yasser Arafat, but it never came to be. But that was his version of Israel and Zionism. And we have an incredible, fascinating, this is from the Jewish Chronicle. Note that this is still Dubnov, right? So this is written in a newspaper, the Jewish Chronicle is the British national Jewish rag, and it was called The Journey of a Jewish Liberal. How could Berlin, he says, the doyen of liberalism and an unyielding critic of authoritarianism and excessive nationalism, which he believed, by the way, was unfortunately where positive liberty led to, right? He's a critic of authoritarianism and excessive nationalism, defend Jewish nationalism without feeling he had fallen prey to an impossible paradox. What kind of intellectual acrobatics allowed him to take seemingly mutually exclusive values such as individual liberty, ethno-nationalism, and present them as compatible and interdependent? Right, this is a fascinating question for any Zionist who is a nationalist, who doesn't believe in nationalism or authoritarianism. How do you square the circle? So Dubnov tells us that it was in Jewish Slavery and Emancipation, an essay published by this paper, the Jewish Chronicle, in 1951, that Berlin explained his position. Zionism, he argued, bequeathed to the world a new type of Jewish collectiveness that ultimately served a greater liberal cause. This is fascinating. How? By turning Jews into free individuals with a wider range of possibilities to choose from, right? So the choose from to do is the positive liberty, but freedom, negative liberty, freedom from. So when the Jews become a new collective, they get the best of both worlds. For Berlin, this was not a Talmudic pilpul, right? An argument picking apart, making up some sort of third way. nor an argument about the nature of nationalism, as much as it was an invitation to rethink what stands at the heart of what we call freedom. Now, Rabbi Sachs, don't forget, wanted to come up with a third way. But what did Berlin do? What made Zionism worth defending, he said, was that it enriched Jewish life in general, creating new circumstances in which Jews had more than one option to choose from. Now, I think this is really fascinating. And we certainly see it in modern Israel today. But I think we have to go back to the I was going to say pre-modern, the 19th and 20th century, early 20th century, the Russia that Berlin came from. I mean, there were two choices. I know this is a huge generalization, but there were two choices. You were part of the community and you were Jewish, or you left and you either converted or you became completely secular. Right, that was it. I'm talking about, historically. I'm not talking about later in the 20th century. There were shtetls, and even in the big cities, the Jews all lived closer together. You either belonged to the community in the synagogue, you were in the clan, or you were out. But what Israel has allowed for is every choice possible. Every choice possible. Whether you're Ashkenazi, Sephardi, gay, it doesn't matter. An artist, secular, heretic, you're all part of the Jewish community, the Israel community. So Zionism allowed for a great expression of freedom, and that was what was worth defending. It doesn't mean he wouldn't attack the bad side. So Berlin himself, in his essays in the history of ideas, says the following. There's also an extraordinary excursus on the Hasidic movement. Whereas the reform movement inspired by Moses Mendelssohn is an attempt to dilute Judaism and to free the Jewish people on foreign soil, which is patently impossible, the great revivalist sect of the Hasidim is a genuine development of the Jewish religion, a response to the authentic need for life on the part of the devout masses, for fresh significance for old symbols, and therefore destined for a great future. I mean, when I read this, it was like mind-blowing, right? This is a, secular Jew. He's proud of his Judaism. I would think that he would attack the Hasidic movement and defend the Reform movement, but, he sees the Reform movement as a dilution of Judaism. I'm not judging, I'm just saying what he said. Whereas the Hasidim are, right, this idea we had from Rabbi Sachs, the history of ideas. Ideas have power, and they're handed down from generation to generation. It's also an expression of what Rabbi Sachs called cherut, the permanency of the ideas. So for Berlin, there was this revitalization of Jewish life through the Hasidim. And that really is fascinating. Okay. So, Ignatieff, towards the end of the book, says of Berlin, given what we've just read, it's quite interesting to see how he describes Isaiah Berlin. He was a skeptic rather than a heretic. And he expressed this radical skepticism gently, assuring the chief rabbi, Emanuel Jacobowitz, who was the chief rabbi before Rabbi Sachs, that he would certainly like to believe in God and an afterlife, but had simply no evidence that such things existed. That he's a rationalist, philosopher. Yet religious skepticism lived happily with religious observance. We talked about Pesach, which was mentioned here, but wherever he was in the world on Yom Kippur, he made a point of fasting and going to synagogue. And as long as his mother was alive, was celebrating Pesach. Many of his Jewish friends were surprised that Berlin never took his Judaism in the direction of reform. The Reform movement was supposed to purify Judaism of archaisms and adapt its ethical message for a modern day. Berlin was adamant that if there was to be observance, it had to be as authentic, as traditional, as close to the ancient faith as possible. And he joked, the Orthodox synagogue is the synagogue that I am not attending. So he has a really interesting connection to Judaism, but even though he's not Orthodox, he admires the authenticity. And maybe it's the history, and maybe it's the ideas, but I don't know, refreshing is not necessarily the right word, but for me it's quite refreshing that it's somebody who has very clear philosophical ideas about the world, the stuff which is not about Judaism, history of ideas, power of ideas, the importance of freedom, and lived that life, right? He's a skeptic. I don't believe in God or the afterlife because I have no evidence. But the Orthodox stream of Judaism represents an authentic path. And I think that's very powerful. So James Chappell wrote about Isaiah Berlin and his Jewish identity. And he says, Berlin dealt with the question of national identity more openly and directly and with more subtlety than almost anyone else, right? For in the non-Orthodox world, right? I'm obviously, my identity is clear. His life and work can be seen as an attempt to answer the question asked by Misha Goodman in Dr. Zhivago. What does it mean to be a Jew? And this is why I find this series so fascinating, because we're taking non-Orthodox, non-traditional thinkers, Jewish thinkers, who will help us to understand important questions on Judaism, on Zionism. But what does it mean to be a Jew? If you haven't seen it, just Google Rabbi Sachs, What Does It Mean to Be a Jew? It's a great cartoon. Perhaps Berlin's unsuitability for public life stemmed from the terrific complexity of his private life. Isaiah Berlin was not solely or even primarily a Jew. He had to balance this facet of his identity with equally powerful Russian and English ones. Those are more obviously evident in Berlin's life and work, and Berlin effortlessly locates their respective influence in The Three Strands in My Life, an essay that he wrote in 1979. As Berlin himself admitted, the influence of his Jewish inheritance is not nearly so easy to codify. Although he occasionally wrote about Jewish topics, he wrote no Jewish volume to complement Russian thinkers. Russian thinkers is a great book about, I think it was 18, 19 Russian thinkers. And while he was acquainted with the elite of Israel, he never moved there, never assumed a powerful position in its government. It is significant, though, that Berlin ends his autobiographical essay with the Jewish strand of his identity. The reader does not suppose that it is unimportant or an afterthought. Rather, Berlin tells us his Jewish roots are too deep-rooted for him to even consider. As for my Jewish roots, they are so deep, so native to me, that it is idle for me to try to identify them, let alone analyze them. Right? To be Jewish for Berlin, it's like it is who he is. And he can't unpack it because it's Berlin. Right? I was thinking yesterday, I was teaching the Guide for the Perplexed, and the Maimonides talks about things that are necessary and things that are contingent. So Berlin might say whether he had hair on his head or he was bald or wore glasses or not, these are contingent, they don't define him. Right? He would still be Berlin, whether he was 6'5" or 5'10". But being Jewish, in a sense, was necessary. Right? That's who he was. If you took away his Jewishness, there would be nothing left. So the human experience for Berlin is linked with choice and self-creation. If we submit to the dictates of a rationally conceived and coherent set of abstract ideas, we are blinding ourselves to the possibilities of meaning of human existence. This is what I felt was like, his resistance to Judaism was because of that what seems to be giving up on possibilities. Isaiah Berlin loved to quote Joseph Butler, who said that things and actions are what they are, and the consequences of them will be what they will be. He might well have applied it to himself. Berlin was not a liberal or a conservative or an Englishman or a Russian or a Jew or an atheist or an agnostic. He was all of these things and none of them. Isaiah Berlin was Isaiah Berlin, and that is surely enough. It's a great way to sum up his life and his thought. Before I stop the presentation, I will take questions. I just want to show you next week because George Steiner will be coming up next week, and he's really going to challenge many of us. And I want you to remember, Berlin said we need a place, we need to be understood. But just to give you a bit of a taste for next week, I've given this quote from his book, My Unwritten Books. The cost, however, can be ominous. Like other fundamentalists, the Orthodox cultivate contempt for, even devastation of the outsider. They hold an abjection, the Reformed Jew, in abjection. Those who inhabit Israel condemn the state as it has not been validated by the Messiah, an Orthodox mob seeking to annul by intimidation or violence some touch of secular freedom is a parody of Jewish ethical philosophical values, while at the same time underwriting the wonder of survival. I'm going to unpick that quote. We could spend the whole hour next week unpicking that quote, but he's a bit grumpy about every single aspect of Judaism, Zionism, and Israel. But we'll see some fascinating things next week about George Steiner. So, whew, let me just check the chat. Please feel free to try.
Can you post the sources again? Because I came on late and I couldn't access them.
I don't know if I can repost. Or,
Yes, you did. You did. Oh, somebody reposted it.
oh,
Okay.
perfect. Thank you. Good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Your help. Okay. So, Arnie back in 1821, 21 minutes past 6, tells us that there's a fascinating paradox that we're most free when we're an Eved Hashem, when we're servants to God. So I'll tell you that the most fascinating thing I think on this was a piece by Rav Soloveitchik in Halachic Man, where Rav Soloveitchik essentially says we should be an Eved Hashem, right? Serve God until we get to the point where we lose freedom, right? It's a very weird paradox. So we use our freedom to ultimately give up our freedom. But that's like I suppose Maimonides would think about it as a natural cause and effect, right? Once I immerse myself into Torah mitzvot to such an extent, and I'm an Eved Hashem, a servant of God, then I would lose my freedom. And maybe that's a little bit what Berlin is pushing back, not the ultimate, but to be an Eved Hashem means that you ultimately will give up freedom, and Berlin can't have that. Okay. Yes, so Herb says, interesting that his view of reform is not authentic. Most non-religious Israelis, yeah, when involved in religious experience, choose Orthodox venues. Okay, I don't know about that last part, and you may be right. But in the academic world, I would imagine that there's a huge number of academics who are Orthodox, but many philosophers and thinkers would either be secular or reformed, I think, on the whole. Okay, just going through. Yeah, I don't know if you read Moreh Nevuchim. Okay, and you should have received an email. Any other thoughts or questions? Please don't be shy.
Yes, I have one. I think that last week when we were discussing people who could be added to your list, there was one we missed, Leo Strauss.
Yeah, I'd like to deal with Leo Strauss, but we'll see. We'll see. As I said last week, just all write lovely things about me to Rabbi Kelman, and then we'll have multiple series on non-Orthodox thinkers.
I would just like to testify to the fact that he was, as a person, he was a lovely man. I had the privilege of meeting him. I was in Oxford as a graduate student in the early 1970s. Um, and in fact, my college, New College, was right next to All Souls. And I had an occasion where Freddie Air, AJ Air, Freddie Air, stuck his head out of a window and screamed at us because we were playing classical music in next door. But um, Sir Isaiah, although as you brought in one of the quotes, he didn't attend shul. No, I never saw him in shul. And I'm not a philosopher. I'm a scientist. I studied physics and chemistry, but I belong to the Jewish Society. The Jewish Society met every Friday night during term. And after having dinner, the group adjourned to one of the colleges where there was a speaker or an event. And I'm sure that that's where I met him. He showed up some of the time. He was interested in these things. Like I was in my 20s, and obviously he was somewhat older in the 1970s, as you
Yeah.
showed from the biography. And so again, I testify that he was a very pleasant, lovely man who could speak to anybody.
Thank you so much for sharing, Asha. At some point, we'll have to sit down over a single malt whiskey and talk about your experiences at Oxford. I mean, everything I've read about Isaiah Berlin, he was a great speaker and a great person to be with, and even his books, which are full of great ideas, are if you read them, it's like hearing him. That's what people said. We had a rabbi in London who died many years ago now, called Rabbi Isaac Bernstein. I don't know if any of you have heard of him, but he was a great speaker. He was a real great orator. And I think it was after he died, they put out a couple of volumes of his drashot on the parsha, and it made me cry because when I read it, I could hear his voice, and I think that's the same as Isaiah Berlin in many ways. So thank you so much for sharing. Wonderful, wonderful. We've got 2 minutes, so
I have a question.
yeah.
Why did you choose to only do on the 20th century philosophers?
Why did
You choose to only do on the 20th century?
well, this course, because I think I tell you why primarily. It's because they all had to deal with the birth of the State of Israel and Zionism, which is really, we see here that this is in many ways, I think it's fair to say, Isaiah Berlin's view, whilst he felt conflicted, was the most parav. Like it's easy enough for us to swallow the pill of what he says, right? Because we can all recognize the problem of extreme nationalism, and we can see the things he said. But others, including Steiner, we'll see had very anti-Zionist or anti-nationalist views, and they wanted something else for Jewish people. So that's why. Listen, I'm happy to go on with multiple series. We'll do 20th century, 19th century, 18th century. We'll see how far we can go back. Okay. Okay. Mel says Rabbi Bernstein's shiurim were amazing. Were you local, Mel?
No, I used to get tapes every week. They were fantastic. The tapes were
Wow.
distributed, and they were
Yeah.
really. We
We're showing.
circulated among my friends where I live, and we were addicted to them.
Yeah, well, so we're showing our age now, but yes, I had all those tapes, then I had them on CD, and now I think they're all online. So Rabbi Bernstein used to give a weekly Monday night parasha shir, and there would be 200-300 people turn up every week. It's a rare, in a standard shul. and he had this booming Irish accent, and he had certain
Yes,
catchphrases.
he did.
Mel, I don't want to make you get emotional, but you know, he used to say, "You know and I know." He spoke like that, right? So yeah, so I never heard Isaiah Berlin, unfortunately, but I did hear Rabbi Bernstein. Okay, it's 7 o'clock, everyone. I don't see any more questions coming through. Next week, please God, Shir will be at the same time. I'll be in the middle of a wedding. I'm not going to subject you all to the dancing, but I'm going to be between a chuppah and a dinner in a big venue. So I'm going to find a nice quiet room and we'll have a shir. I might look smarter than I do now. Maybe not, but I'm looking forward to next week, please God.
Thank you. Chag Sameach.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Shabbat shalom.